increasingly it's about actual personal ties. So in the Clinton years, actually Al Gore, who has a long-standing commitment to tech, who develops really, really close ties with leading figures in Silicon Valley. And so in the second term of the Clinton administration is having monthly meetings where he's bringing in major tech figures to have dinner with him and talk about big ideas. So they're actually getting policy ideas and able to influence policy in various different ways.
Welcome to another episode of Captivated, a podcast hosted by the Center for American Political History, Media and Technology at Purdue University. In each episode, we examine a specific facet of our digital public sphere, how it works and how we got here. We're here to help you sort through the noise. I'm Hannah.
I'm Sage.
And I'm Julius.
On today's episode, we're sharing our conversation with history professor Lily Geismer. Lily researches and teaches at Claremont McKenna College outside of Los Angeles. She focuses on modern U.S. history, liberalism, and the Democratic Party.
She has written 2 books alongside public writing for places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Republic. Her scholarship is about the transformation of the Democratic Party and how it shifted away from its blue-collar roots toward being a coalition of professionals and tech elites.
I found that part of the conversation really interesting, particularly when she talked about how the revolving door between industry and government developed.
Yeah, and Lily also talked about tech deregulation in the 1990s. It was championed by Democrats who thought it would promote competition and benefit consumers, but actually it just created massive monopolies like Amazon, Google, and Meta.
Throughout the conversation, Lily explained how these shifts toward deregulation have led to severe consequences for the average American, like job losses, the monopolization of information by those same tech billionaires, and rising prices where we have to now take out a loan to buy eggs.
So we began by asking Lily about the relationship between the Democratic Party and big tech.
I'm not a overwhelmingly tech-oriented person. I always say I can barely turn my computer on and have to even get my 9-year-old to help me with various different things. But the big questions that have interested me is these larger shifts that have happened in the Democratic Party as the party has shifted from being a more urban, industrial-based party and a lot of union density to being a more suburban, professional-oriented party. And the first book that I wrote, which is called Don't Blame Us, Suburban Liberals and the Transformation of the Democratic Party, is a case study of the Route 128 area outside of Boston. So it's looking at these 5 Boston suburbs that were really shaped by the sort of tech industry in various different ways. So they're an industry that primarily spins off from MIT and Cold War defense spending. And then so that kind of research and the arena of research and development then is really what spawns kind of the emergence of the high-tech industry. So looking at these kinds of engineers and their politics led me to larger questions around tech, and then also particularly to thinking about how the relationship with the tech industry, both in terms of tech workers, but also tech as an economic tool of growth, comes to fundamentally define the Democratic Party from the period really starting in the 50s, but especially in the 70s and beyond. And so it's something that I started working on in my first book, but then is also a major theme in my second project, Left Behind, where I look at the Democratic Party, especially during the kind of Clinton era's embrace of market-based solutions to solve inequality. And tech is a key piece of that project.
And can you tell us a little bit more about how the relationship between the Democratic Party and the tech industry, the fusion between those kind of logics and ways of thinking, how that relationship has played out?
Yeah. So one of the things is this commitment to entrepreneurial-based growth, but some of the things is a kind of generational shift that happens in the Democratic Party starting in the 1970s. And so in the 70s, there's this huge economic recession and crisis, and some of it is a kind of crisis of the Keynesian economic model.
Can you just unpack that a little bit further?
That's kind of what the linchpin of really liberalism in the 20th century, which is this idea of government spending to stimulate the economy. And it's a consumer-based model, heavily based on manufacturing. And it breaks down in the 1970s. And so Democrats and then also economists are looking for other types of solutions and see the solution to these problems of deindustrialization in tech, essentially. And so it really starts in the 70s of a group of Democrats who are first called the Watergate babies and then get known as the Atari Democrats, who are pushing the importance of the Democrats really investing in tech. And so some of it actually is like they want government spending, but mostly through subsidies and tax credits to go to the tech industry to grow. And that will be really important to the nation's future.
I really like how you spelled it out and left behind the sort of New Democrats and the Clinton administration's idea of doing well by doing good, whereas FDR liberalism was doing well and doing good, and that being a shift from one to the other.
Yeah. So, in some ways, like one kind of, I guess, fallacy or assumption is like Democrats have long supported economic growth. There was a really importance of like growing the economy and then having what's known as a compensatory welfare state. So welfare supports what's happening, like filling in the gaps. And so that's the kind of separating them. What happens amongst the New Democrats is that they really believe like the market can do good. So if you do that economic growth or these tools of the economy, and if it's tech, that can help everybody. So actually, you don't need a social safety net. You don't need compensatory welfare because the market can do those kinds of things. And so the idea is either to grow the market, integrate poor people into the market, or to bring the market to them.
So I was curious then, if the Democrats got all in bed with big tech, how does that compare, that relationship between the Democratic Party and technology companies? How's that different from the relationship between the Republican Party and technology companies?
I think it's some of the ways that the Democrats sell this or make it so important to their project. And so one of the ideas of this is like traditionally we think of Republicans as the party of big business and Democrats as the party of the working man and there to solve social equality. But one of the things through tech you can see is the ways that shifts. And so Democrats have long had relationships to business, but I think it comes into really sharp focus where they're prioritizing that over their connections to helping working people by creating these tight ties with the tech industry. This will help everybody. I think the other thing, even though tech as an industry is not partisan or particularly ideologically focused, there was an idea amongst Democrats that this tech as an industry was more in line with their particular values. So one of the things about the tech industry, and this is especially in the 70s and then onward, is that it eventually becomes this, but not focused on like defense spend it. Like it's not heavy weaponry. Another huge part of it is that it's much ostensibly more environmentally sensitive than like manufacturing. So that this was help. It's with the larger goals of the economy. And then also that it believes one of the core things that I look at in my research is that Democrats are really interested in questions of opportunity and meritocracy. And tech is traditionally a very meritocratic industry. So if you like the smartest people do the best, it rewards that. And so that falls in line with these other logics of the Democratic Party. And it's seen as very future-oriented. So it's not tied in the past. It's very much future-oriented. One of Bill Clinton's favorite phrases is like that he's building a bridge to the 21st century. And tech is the critical part of that bridge.
And can you tell us a little bit more about what that actually looks like, the relationship between big tech and the New Democrats, between Bill Clinton and some of these people, Hannah used the phrase, in bed with big tech. But what does that actually look like?
Sure. It can go in a couple ways. And there's the question of policy versus politics. So initially, so there's a part of platforms and statements saying we want to give subsidies to grow this industry. And we see this as like the sort of space of the future. Another is starting to see many more Democrats looking to Silicon Valley and other tech-oriented sectors as spaces of actually getting campaign donations from them. So like going there for donations. And then increasingly, it's about actual personal ties. So in the Clinton years, it's actually Al Gore, who has a long-standing commitment to tech, who develops really, really close ties with the leading figures in Silicon Valley. And so in the second term of the Clinton administration is having monthly meetings where he's bringing in major tech figures to have dinner with him and talk about big ideas. So they're actually getting policy ideas and able to influence policy in various different ways. If you just go through the roles of who's going to the White House during the second Clinton administration, it's a lot of tech figures who are there giving talk, they're promoting various different things. So that's kind of, I would say, like a symbolic, like being in bed with them. They're part of the same kind of milieu to some degree, and that solidifies these types of bonds.
So that famous image of the second Trump inauguration that was going around of the kind of people that were there, the Jeff Bezos, the Mark Zuckerberg, etc. I think a lot of people found it quite jarring, potentially, but it's actually not that different from what was happening during the Clinton administration.
Yeah, I think there were also members of the leading Silicon Valley figures who were at the Clinton's second inauguration. If you look at like Obama was constantly in Silicon Valley doing meetings at Facebook during both of his terms. So no, I don't think that's necessarily a new thing. I mean, I think that was, I guess, striking for their literal position on the dais, which I think nothing had been seen like that. I also think that stands for the cultural shift of the tech industry and the American culture from the 2025 when that was to like the 90s, where there was a much more sort of sense of tech is a good thing and this faith in these various different companies. And I think that has shifted. So even I think 10 years ago, I remember my nephew wrote this thing where he had to ask about Great America, and he wrote about Elon Musk. I guess there are kids who are still doing that, but not that many. So I think there's been a shift in the cultural attitudes towards those things. I guess but my kids see those like trucks and freak out. So
the cyber trucks.
Yeah, I think it's like there's been like this rapid shift. And I thought those trucks were made for like who they should be appealing to. It's
because they look like Lego.
Like 8-year-olds. It's like who their primary audience is. So that I do think there's been a larger shift, and that's also what is the image on the dais represents.
And so thinking about this moment of deregulation that we're in, what do you think the problem for the broader public is with deregulation? Like, what does that mean for the average American when this is happening?
Yeah. And so I would say like one of the things that I write about and have spoken about in other places is, especially during the Clinton era, there was a lot of deregulation of tech. And their idea is that competition is good for the American consumer. Like if things are deregulated, then the market will correct. And also there was a real faith in the internet. I mean, when you look at the early days of the internet, of this is producing certain kinds of knowledge, so therefore we shouldn't be regulating its content. It's against civil liberties in various different ways. And that sets up a particular infrastructure around how tech is oriented. So one of the things is like, there was a lot of faith in self-regulation. So like the industry should self-regulate and then we should trust them. That produces a certain challenge to actually doing regulation later. So during the Clinton years, I think it must have been the FTC. I have to remember this in my mind, but had a suit against Microsoft for being a monopoly. So there was this effort, and those charges dissipate in various different ways. And Bill Gates like reinvents the company, reinvents the sort of philanthropic image of himself. But I think that there's been a long-standing effort. The questions of regulating these companies has been really difficult, especially when these policies have played a role in actually producing them. The Biden administration did actually try to do substantial regulation of the tech industry, both around issues of monopolies. I mean, so these big suits against Google and Amazon, and then also around AI issues, trying to put in place certain regulations. And those were clearly unpopular amongst tech figures. And so we start to see this shift away that I think that's the other symbol for. So one of the things that's important is like the Democrats are trying to like believe in this, have this faith in growth as the mechanism for the future, but so do these tech companies. What they're invested in is the growth of their own companies. And that was really like the main ethos of most of them. So the way to do that is potentially through these other relationships. So, and as we've seen in the last year, like the Trump administration has not aggressively been going after any of these companies on issues of antitrust violations, and also Trump repealed most of the AI regulations. So that I think plays a major role too.
So what does this mean then, that we don't have strong regulation of tech and actually it's self-regulating? What does that create?
I mean, in one way, it creates monopolies of the companies. I mean, so you allow Amazon. I mean, I think this is not just a question for Joe on the street in terms of our content, but actually also in terms of our jobs. I mean, to me, you can pick your company that you want to focus on. There's large-scale questions around the fact that the lack of regulation has allowed Amazon to grow exponentially and now is planning to have 75% of its operations workforce be automated. That matters. I mean, from a labor perspective, it's allowing those practices to happen without any government involvement or government oversight or regulation. I think there are huge actual questions around content or what we consume. And so the other thing that's disturbing is the ways in which these tech figures also control the media that we consume in various different ways. But that can go to both in terms of social media, which is one area, but actually legacy media too. And so in the last week, watching what's happened to the Washington Post, which is another question when you allow the kinds of monopoly that has happened. I mean, it's affected these other kinds of, like the idea of running legacy media like it's a tech company has had its own implications where we're now actually losing a lot of content. I mean, so to not have a sports section or a local section of the Washington Post is very troubling to the average person. I mean, I think that's one example of a place that would happen, but that is going to have cascading effects.
Yeah, it sounds like that, and you tell me where I'm wrong when I restate all of this, is that there's a problem of these companies basically consolidating power. amongst each other and just a few companies running everything. And as they begin to do that, they begin to venture into other sectors and take over those as well, kind of not only monopolizing their area, but monopolizing the economy. And in part also pushing out the average worker and trying to maintain as much profit for themselves. So like for the average American, one, they're losing jobs, they're losing resources, but they're also losing access to information, to content, to knowledge, all in the pursuit of this deregulation that really doesn't serve the average American, but really only serves the company.
Absolutely. That was a very astute and eloquent way of restating it. So I think you can think about those questions in a couple of different ways. The other thing it's crowding out, and like this goes to the question of entrepreneurship, it's also crowding out like startups. So there's this idea, like a lot of the Democrats traditionally supported startups, but that's not actually what ended up, that's not where the growth happened. It's actually hurting small business. One of the arguments that Clinton era made is like this is good for the American consumer because you're exponentially producing either more information or also like it brings down the cost of goods, but that has not happened. And I think the issue too is not thinking about this from a labor perspective also has really severe implications, because even if the cost of goods are down, like because Amazon's allowed to be a monopoly, which by the way actually is driving prices up, not downward. So if people don't have jobs to buy goods, it doesn't really do people that much good. So I think that's part of the problem too.
Yeah. And so I think now that we've clearly kind of laid out the problem here, I think it would be a good place to transition, because we don't want to just sit here and just talk about the problems. It would be good to hear from your perspective some of the solutions that you have. So in terms of thinking of your work, are there any solutions to this problem that we're facing?
It's a challenging moment right now to think about, just given some of these things. But I think it's actually to go back to the power of government. And we've seen government be so challenged and threatened and actually hollowed out in the last year. But actually looking back to these mechanisms are there. Like there are laws in place to do regulation. So that's one place, but also to actually make the federal government, in some ways, like that's the only force that has the power to stop big corporations, which goes back to like the early 20th century, like why we have enforcement in the first place, and to the New Deal as well. So I think that's a huge place of thinking at those questions. I think from an information perspective, it's trying to find more localized or other mechanisms such to produce information. So, I mean, I think that there's an interesting question in some way that like information that can fill in the voids that some of this has caused. And I actually think like I'm not an expert in it by any means, but like the Substack model is super fascinating. And that's actually a tech-based solution. But like that has enabled a lot of these journalists who have lost their jobs to like still produce information. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons I think in the first place, like places like Washington Post are actually in crisis and responding in the ways they are. But I do think that as ways of finding alternative means to produce information have a lot of potential, or podcasts.
So we're part of the solution.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also really interesting thinking about the place of the market versus public good. To me, underlying a lot of the work that you've been doing, it seems to be making that case that even just straightforwardly, like regulation is not necessarily the answer. It's thinking about how the government thinks about the relationship between the market and playing an active role in reducing social inequality and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a question of what its purpose is. And this goes back to the core of what defines the 20th century Democratic Party or liberalism, is the idea of using the federal government to solve problems of inequality. I mean, that is like what the New Deal was, and that's what its purpose was going forward through, in some ways, what the Clinton era Democrats thought they were doing, although they were using the market as the mechanism to do that. So I think going back to those ideas are really, really important. I think beyond the question just with tech or media, but is that we have watched the federal government has lost. I think it's a wake-up call to be like, those are actually the good and are there to work for the public good, if that's the larger goal. I think that we've watched as our public sector has become so denuded, and it's really important to bring that back. And that goes to the same question, like with the importance of media, of having this controlled by private corporations has its own implications, that you're not actually producing like public conversation or public sector, which often can come from having these non-monopoly controlled sources of media.
And so thinking about this, do you have any like interventions that you heard or that you find intriguing that might be beneficial in terms of making change on this problem?
I think, well, one of the things that's important is NPR and so watching and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, actually those were federal or government. I was just saying as we were walking over here, I'm the daughter of a PBS producer. But PBS was a critical source for so many people and actually a quite democratic idea when you only had 3 channels that lots of children of the 70s and 80s and beyond, that's where they got their education.
It's my ABC.
Yeah, and
Street.
and I think of this my own kids because it was on by that point it was on HBO don't have that anymore. So I think some of those types of things I'm not we need to have government controlled media sources, but I do think there's value in understanding those as public goods and what it is to have those kinds of spaces. So that would be one. That some of the things that are not, and I think some of the bigger questions is taking the profit out of various the profit orientation out of how various different forms of media is produced. I think that's the question with a place like the Washington Post. So instead of thinking about the purpose of the Post to provide critical knowledge to people, instead of it became a profit-oriented institution, and that's where downfalls are. So trying to find ways to get beyond those profit-oriented things, which I think sometimes does come from government support because that's where you don't need to have a profit.
So one of the things that you could do, I guess, as an individual is to support a lot of more of that kind of public media.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a key thing for all of us to be doing in a lot of different ways. Just not to say go give money to your local NPR station, which you should do anyway. But the other one is that you should be listening to those as well and looking to those kinds of places. But I think local stations too. So one of the huge issue is the decline in local media and actually trying to think about ways to regenerate that. I usually talk much more about politics than I do about media, so this is kind of refreshing for me, but I make the same argument about politics, that it's a moment right now to get involved in local politics really matter, and it's actually a place where you can make a huge difference. So I think local media is the same idea. And I do think there have been innovations such to make that a much lower barrier to entry than there used to be. So I think that's a possibility. I think one of the problems that comes up is proliferation. So I think there's things that become
paralyzed by choice.
Yeah, I always try to explain this to my students that you have this with TV, the idea of having 4 stations. It's now you can't handle. There's just so much out there that I think that is actually producing its own crisis and problem too.
I think so too. I grew up in Sweden, and in Sweden, media is seen as something that's really important for our democracy. So we, help fund it through tax money, and that's how we fund public service, radio and TV. And also, we help support local newspapers that otherwise would not exist, just because it is a democracy issue. So I'm always blown away when I'm listening to, radio here, and it's ads all the time. We never hear ads on our public service radio. And actually, one way that they support that is if you buy a radio or a television set, you then need to pay a specific tax that goes to produce programming, so that's one way.
Well, I think that would be a great, and they always do that on the radio, think about how much you, because I think about that with how much I listen to NPR, and it's, a cup of coffee, even less than a cup of coffee. But I think those questions, and I think one of the things that's really challenging about this always that comes up to me is how little of the federal budget the actual spending of media is or would be. And so it's been on the chopping block for, years, but it is so valuable to a functioning democracy, but how devalued it is. But it's such a time. This has been a bigger question with things like Doge, but those are low-hanging fruit, but actually don't impact the scope of the federal budget. So we should look to Sweden.
Yeah, but sadly, so we have a far-right party that is now the second largest party in the government. And media support is one of the things that have been on the chopping block there too. So this is sadly something we see globally being attacked.
And as well with deregulation, I think that's happening all over the world. And so that brings us to the point where it would be good to hear from you based on this conversation and kind of what you've been thinking about. For our audience, what are some key takeaways that they should walk away with? Hey, these are the key points you need to be thinking about.
Well, I think one is to understand that there's a key evolution. And I think with that question around issues of deregulation is that certain choices became made such to make that possible. So to be having these huge corporations is not a natural thing. It was allowed to happen for various different reasons. And some of it was in good intention. It's not to say it was all nefarious, good intentions to it in some ways to be we want to have economic growth. It was just economic growth at the top that didn't actually create equitability. So I do think that question of the power of regulation as being really important. And I know it's not the hottest issue, but it is like a really important one to thinking about both issues of equality, but also to democracy. And I think that finding alternative mechanisms such that like that is possible in choices that we make as individuals, but also the pressure that we put on our officials and policymakers to push for these things going forward.
No, I think you have explained it really well, because I think for me, I always hear about deregulation, that it's a good thing because, more money, more profits, more jobs, all that stuff. But I think you've explained it well, like the benefit and the importance of regulation in a way that makes it clear to even me, someone who probably should know more about it. But it made sense to me, the importance and the necessity of regulation for the betterment of everyone.
Well, I'm glad that the regulation matters. I mean, there is a place, too, of like it can go too far. I mean, so that's one of the problems is sometimes there can be like issues of overregulation actually can harm certain forms of growth. And so it has to be kind of monitored. But I think that this is a particular sector that has been allowed for a number of different reasons to grow, to be deregulated. And the idea of that, I mean, one of the things I think that is especially important is like the idea of deregulation was supposed to actually stop monopolies, but it rarely happens. So we've just seen, like, all we've seen is consolidation. And the same thing, actually, I will say, I didn't talk about this, but like the corollary policy in the Clinton years is the Telecommunications Act. And that was also supposed to be a deregulatory tool that was like, we're going to have competition everywhere and this will help. We're going to break up these companies and like they can all just do everything. And then what you saw is a consolidation by the early 2000s of 5 media corporations. And so, who like basically come to control everything. And that is just not good for the economy, but it's not good for the average person.
Yeah, I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah. And so what we always try to ask before we end our conversations with our guests is that with all this craziness, all this stuff happening around us, we always want to hear from our experts kind of your media diet, what you engage with. So, what do you read, watch, listen to, kind of to figure out what's happening in the world. So we try to break it down in terms of like, what's your meat and to veg? Like, what do you go to consistently?
I'm still like a New York Times reader. So, and that is like to my core. So I consistently go to the New York Times.
And are you a like physical copy of the New York Times?
So I get the Sunday New York Times, which I like, but I think I get it mostly aspirationally because it like sits in a pile. And so I'm like, one day I will sit down and like read the New York Times, like this, like the hard copy. I actually will say, like, I used to get it. There was a period where I got it every day, and like you see tons of stuff that you wouldn't see otherwise. Like I think the way, even when it's like you read so selectively, I actually don't think you see everything on the page. So when I read the print copy, all kinds of things. But like the same thing of doing historical research, because like when I was doing the research for my first book, a lot of it was the Boston Globe and it wasn't keyword searchable. And so I'd read the whole Boston Globe, but you start to see like all kinds of connections or things I would miss when I just do like a keyword search. And so I found that to be the case too when I'm reading. I'm really committed to the New Yorker. I love the New Yorker. So that I try to read like every week. I sometimes skip some articles that are not always totally.
What are your favorite parts of the New Yorker?
I like a lot of the human interest stories, and I think they do really good political coverage of various different issues. So I always find interesting things. I think it makes you like a jerk at parties because you like have read like one, like I'm always like, oh, you're a scientist. Like I've read like that one article from the New Yorker on like this topic, but I am like an expert on your topic.
Both scientists.
Yeah, we are both exactly. We both study like I'm trying to think like some like weird flower. So I love the deep dives. So those are like my consistent ones. I live about 40 minutes from where I work, so I'm in the car a lot. So I do listen to NPR. I also listen to my go-to podcasts are The Daily, so I'm also boring in that way. And I listen to the Ezra Klein Show. So I guess my New York Times loyalty is really coming out here. I love the show The Dig, but it's really long. So I have to that's like a 4-hour investigate. Like it's like there are like 2 hours that it seems to take a long time. And then a lot of my news, I'm a kind of like voyeuristic Twitter and Blue Sky person. I was not an early person to join, so it doesn't always make sense to me. Like when I'm reading, I feel like it's like people who caught on early understand it better than I do. But I get a lot of suggestions from people. My mom constantly is sending me stuff, but my husband sends me articles, so I will do it that way. I used to be much better at looking constantly at every news source. I feel like this is my own. This is making me feel guilty about my capacity. And I used to honestly read I found the Washington Post great. I have stopped reading that, and I try to read the LA Times too, because I live in LA, and I've now lived here long enough that I should be reading the LA Times. So I try to look, and the LA Times has really good coverage too. So those are my go-to places. We have like a local. I live on the east side of LA, and there's like the East Sider, but that's like very niche,
very specific,
very specific things. So those are my media place. I love long form podcasts, and I just listened to a really good one, and I'm like totally blanking on the name, about the death of a labor activist. So I'll have to get the name for you of that. But they're actually like, I know this from talking to people who work in podcast. Like I have good friends who work in podcast production or media. Those are really expensive to make, so they've stopped making these like big ones. There's one on the Big Dig that I'm obsessed with in Boston, and so I think that's a great podcast, which I would recommend everyone listen to.
I used to get confused between the Big Dig and the Dig, like those two,
that
series on that show, and to be like, everyone's really interested in the like this infrastructure project in Boston. Like, I don't understand why.
Well, I just gave you to do both, so you can go read the Dig and the Big Dig. Yeah. They are different, but there's a great podcast about the Big Dig. I love TV. That's probably my more escapist.
Okay, well, lean into the guilty.
Tell us about your... come into that. Yeah.
Tell us about your junk food, your guilty pleasures.
Well, I love shows that take me out of the moment, but not too out of the moment. So my favorite pandemic show was, and you'll be so excited about this for your Scandinavian love, was Borgen, because I could pretend that I lived in Denmark in like 2011 and then be like, everything's great. And so that I watched, but then I actually had never watched The West Wing.
No way.
And so I initially started watching The West Wing 2 years ago because I thought I was going to write something about it and write something critically about its meanings, but then I just got really into The West Wing. And so I took a break, but I've actually been finding in this moment watching The West Wing is really nice because I can imagine I'm living in Aaron Sorkin's fantasy world of like, do you watch it too?
They put it on Netflix, and so I started watching it. My only struggle is I'm struggling because there's so many characters.
There are a lot of characters. I'm
trying to get invested in, I'm trying to find my character.
Oh, yeah, you get there. And it goes in and out. I found that to be like a nice, I can just pretend that I'm in this weird utopian world of it's not even, I will say this because I spent a lot of time studying the Clintons. It's like just fascinating how far this moment is from that moment. So that I find it interesting from that respect. So those are my shows. But I also watch a variety of different other TV shows. I have no impulse control, so I'll watch them really fast, and then I'm sad when they're over. I recently watched Heated Rivalry, which I loved that, so I will recommend that to everyone too.
Yeah, I also absolutely loved it. And what you're talking about, the sort of like despair you feel when it's over.
It's sad. It's like, I know. I'm not very good. I have very good. I'm not. Yeah, my friend is reading the full. Like she's gone. Series. Yeah, on. I'm not that committed to Heated Rivalry. I haven't gotten quite there yet, but you do because you get really invested, and I think it is fascinating to me too, the ways in which, like, I actually have not been watching it, but like shows, I like The Pit a lot. I think that it has but I think actually like the watching of a show when it's released every week is different. So going back now, we have this thing where we like watch things in such concentrated ways that I actually think is not great. So I think trying to space
going back to serialized rather than binging.
Yes.
Absolutely. We appreciate you so much for coming on and having this conversation with us. And we want to ask, where can our listeners find you and find your work?
I don't have my own podcast, unfortunately, but I am on several podcasts. You can Google me, probably Lily Geismer, and then my books. And I do write a fair amount for different publications. Most recently, I've written for The Nation, Boston Review, Dissent, and those various different places, and Jacobin too. So those are good places to find me. I did do 2 Dig interviews. So if you didn't feel you got enough here and you want to really spend a lot of time reading, like hearing me talk, those are there for you.
We will absolutely put those in the show notes.
So yeah, those are a lot. And I'm on, and the people who made The Big Dig did a lottery show, which is amazing. It's about the Massachusetts lottery. And I'm in a whole episode about the Massachusetts lottery. So those are some places you can look at too.
So much to listen to, so much to watch. Yeah. Where will it end?
Exactly.
So, we'll be set for a while.
Well, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
This has been another episode of Captivated. It's been hosted by CAPT. CAPTivated. You guys get it. It's the Center for American Political History, Media, and Technology.
The ideas presented by individuals on the podcast are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent Purdue University, which adheres to a policy of institutional neutrality.
To learn more about this episode's guest, check out the show notes. We really enjoyed this conversation today, and we hope you got something out of it too. Thanks for listening.